town has a history, and every town has its legends. And oh yes, most towns have, dare I say, ghost stories. What happens when you have the most popular city in all of Canada, if not one of Canada's biggest tourist destinations, called Niagara Falls, and it plays home to some of the coolest and most chilling legends and ghost stories? Sit back and relax as I take you on a journey through the Niagara region and some of its more intriguing legends, myths, and ghost stories. Bertie Hall, an 1800s mansion located in Fort Erie, Canada, is one of the more interesting haunted places. That is, the stories that surround it. The mansion was built by William Forsyth Sr., a War of 1812 veteran and a very colorful entrepreneur in 1833. And the house used to host many dignitaries from around the world. Supposedly, there was the drowning of Forsyth's son that occurred in the basement as the Niagara River overflowed and the boy got caught and drowned in the tunnel between the river and the basement. And supposedly his ghost haunts the mansion. Over the years, there have been many ghost stories that have been connected to the building, especially when the building at one point was the Mildred Mahoney Dollhouse Museum. You see, the curators of the museum had noticed that during the night, a dollhouse was consistently moved from one side of the bedroom on the second story to the other side of the bedroom. It was only after a psychic who had been visiting the museum commented that the little boy was quite upset that somebody kept putting a girl's dollhouse where his bed was supposed to be. Do you like pink dollhouses? Apparently, whatever was or still is in Bertie Hall didn't like them either. Well, at least not the fact that in the big pink dollhouse that was in the living room of Bertie Hall, there was actually a Ouija board on that coffee table. Coincidence or not? The Meriton Tunnel, also known as the Blue Ghost Tunnel, is an abandoned railway tunnel in Thorold, Ontario. The tunnel was built originally to provide access for trains to run through it, and it was constructed in 1875, and it ran up until the First World War. The tunnel creates an amazing illusion that when you are at the entrance of it and start moving towards the ending of the tunnel, it shrinks and appears to get smaller, and the roof literally feels like it is closing in on you. While the tunnel was being built, there were numerous fatal accidents, and eventually this led to where things are now. Over the years, visitors to the now blocked off, defunct Blue Ghost Tunnel reported seeing not only apparitions within the tunnel and around the tunnel, but also a blue ghostly mist. And they say if you look closely enough, you will see the ghosts of the workers killed in the construction of the tunnel. So the question is, how bad do you want to see the Blue Ghost? Niagara-on-the-Lake is home to the Shaw Festival. There are a few theaters that the Shaw Festival has used over the years, and two of the more interesting historical ones are the Royal George Theatre and the Old Courthouse. The Royal George Theatre, which is very much alive and well today, was built on War of 1812 grounds. Later, it was a blacksmith shop, which would eventually become a vaudeville theater, which would then become a movie theater until the 1980s, when the Shaw Festival took it over as what it is today, a theater of performance. Over the years, actors, crew members have reported strange happenings in the theater: lights flashing, toilets flushing, doors closing, and whispering in ears. But yet nobody is there, even folks witnessing to see apparitions. The old courthouse building was established in the mid-1800s, and not only did it serve as a courthouse, but it also housed jail cells. Over the years, the building has been used for many functions. Interestingly, in the early 1980s, it was used for the Stephen King movie, The Dead Zone, and later it would be used by the Shaw Festival for stage plays as well as other events by other organizations. And oh yes, over the years and the decades, actors, actresses, and other crew members have reported many strange happenings, many strange occurrences, and even witnessing apparitions. Individuals into the parapsychology assert that the Niagara region is one of the most haunted hotspots in all of Canada if not North America, due to the War of 1812. You see, there were 4 primary forts in the area. Old Fort Erie in Fort Erie, Ontario, Fort George in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Fort Mississauga, which was a naval base also in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and across the Niagara River in Youngstown was Old Fort Niagara. And during the War of 1812, a lot of havoc was wreaked and a lot of lives lost. Old Fort Erie has an intriguing ghost story that apparently a headless ghost and an armless ghost, both soldiers, American soldiers, haunt Snake Hill. Apparently, an American soldier was getting a haircut and a shave from an American barber when a British mortar struck both of them, taking off the American soldier's head and the barber's arms. And hence, people see the ghost of these 2 individuals roaming Snake Hill. Fast forward 150 years later, an excavation was done of the site, and they found the remains of several U.S. soldiers. Interestingly, on Snake Hill in one of the graves was a U.S. soldier that had a missing head, and get this, there were 2 extra arms in the shallow grave. And not to be outdone is Old Fort Niagara, which also has ghost tours, and sports one of the more interesting stories as well, kind of parallel to the one at Old Fort Erie. You see, apparently there is a headless ghost who roams the Spanish castle. Yes, there is a Spanish castle in the old fort. And apparently the ghost's head, after being severed by a sword during a sword fight, was thrown out into Lake Ontario, and his body was thrown in an old well. Now, apparently, the ghost comes out on nights of the full moon from the old well. Fort George has many ghost stories. In fact, they have haunted ghost tour walks through the fort, which are very interesting. In fact, one of the cool ghost stories has a young girl following the ghost tour and occasionally playing peekaboo with those taking the tour. Interestingly, it was found out that this little girl is a ghost. Years later, it would be found out that this girl is actually buried down the road at St. Mark's Cemetery, and her name is Sarah Ann. Some of the more bizarre fort ghost stories come from Fort Mississauga, which is just around the corner from Fort George. When it comes to the ghosts at Fort Mississauga, they're actually not oftentimes seen in the fort, but rather outside of the fort, as the fort itself sits at the back of a beautiful golf course. And over the decades, golfers have seen limbless, legless, and dare I say headless apparitions appearing to be soldiers trudging across the green. Everybody likes a good vampire story. Well, on the upper Niagara Parkway, there appears to be the legend of the vampire woman, or so they say. You see, over the decades, folks have reported underneath one of the bridges to one of the side creeks coming off of the Niagara River, they've seen a lady appearing to be from the 1800s who also looks like a vampire. They've reported seeing blood on the sides of her mouth and also very bloodshot eyes. Over the years, the stories have gotten more intense and more chilling, as they say she is looking for her lost baby. Apparently, this lady turned into a vampire or became a vampire around the War of 1812. Her husband went off to war and was killed as the Brits fought the Americans. And apparently this lady had contracted tuberculosis. Now, if you look underneath the bridge on some dreary, eerie night, be sure that you check both ways, and not only in front. As they say, she is lurking beneath the bridge, looking for her baby, or perhaps somebody that can be her next meal. One of the more chilling ghost stories occurs just outside of Niagara Falls. A gentleman coming off of the late afternoon shift from work one evening saw a young man holding a motorcycle helmet standing off to the side of the highway. He asked the fellow if he would like a lift. The young gentleman said, "Absolutely." As they drove, the younger man said very little. It was about 2 miles down the road that the younger gentleman told the driver that this was his street and his house was down at the end. The gentleman turned his vehicle and went to where the younger gentleman said is where he lived. The lights were all off at the house, and the young gentleman climbed out of the vehicle and thanked the driver for dropping him off. It was only when the gentleman started driving away and was about a quarter of a mile down the road, he realized that the young gentleman had left his helmet on the floor in the car. Stopping the vehicle, he turned around and went back to the house, hoping to get the young man before he turned in for the night. The lights were still off at the house. He knocked on the door. He knocked on the door again until finally the lights went on. Upon his surprise, it wasn't the young man facing him, but rather an older lady. A little surprised, he handed the lady the motorcycle helmet because she was also very confused. And he told her, "I believe this might belong to your son or the younger gentleman that lives here. I just gave him a ride home." Holding the helmet, the lady looked at it very curiously and also in shock, and looked at the man and said, "Yes, this is my son's helmet, but my son died in a motorcycle accident 16 years ago." So tell me, did you find my stories creepy, scary, or perhaps chilling like this tunnel? And by the way, this tunnel was used in that same Stephen King movie, The Dead Zone, starring Christopher Walken, who was once walking through the tunnel. Sorry, I couldn't resist. With that said, I have saved the best story for last. And it's not legend, it is not myth, it is factual. The reason I know this is I met the police officers that were at this event. I have the actual police reports, and this event made headlines not only locally here in Ontario, but also across Canada, North America, and the world. Sit back and enjoy. One of the most intriguing and chilling stories in Canadian history occurred in 1970 in St. Catharines, Ontario, where police were called to what they thought was a domestic dispute, only to find out that it would be something that, let's say, they were never trained to deal with. For 28 days, the most bizarre things occurred in this apartment complex. Former police officer Bob Crawford, who was one of the first attending officers to the event, reported the following. a child being pinned to the ground by a chair which was immovable, a child hovering almost 2 feet off of the ground while sitting in a chair, 3 adults sitting on a Chesterfield began to levitate while a Crown attorney was filling out a report and ran out of the building terrified. Perhaps the scariest event occurred in the child's bedroom when everything in the bedroom started flying all over the place other than a crucifix bolted to a wall, and the child who was sitting on a bed began levitating almost 2 feet off of the ground. After the 28 days, a priest had come to visit the child and the family, and everything seemed to stop after the priest's visit. Was this indeed a true poltergeist case or something more diabolical?